Let me know that Prabhu, if you can see.
Yes, Prabhu, we can see the screen.
Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Sorry, I got to just check. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Naraya Namaskritam Naram Cha Eva Narottanamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tado Jayadudire Shnuta Swakada Krishna Punya Shavana Kirtana Hidvantasto Padarani Vednu Tirtsutam Rasta Prayasha Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhakti Bhavati Naishtaki Krishnaya Vasudevaya Devaki Nandanaya Cha Nanda Gopa Kumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Tanamani Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharane Shaisha Shunyavadi Prashthataya Deshatarane Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadda Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay, so we'll continue chapter 12 here. Hare Krishna Pune Mataji, thank you for joining. So this is about the birth of Emperor Parikshit, and we've been reading this chapter and getting close to the end of the chapter at this point. So this is the verse for today, and I'll read first, and those of you that want to repeat, you can. Yakshamana ashvadena nati droha jihasaya raja labda dhana datyaya na anyatra karadhandayo. Yakshamana ashvamedhena Nati Droha Jihasaya Raja Labda Dhana Datyao Na Anyatara Karadhandayo Yakshamano Ashamadena Nati Droha Jihasaya Raja Labda Dhano Datyayu Anyatara Karadhandayo. Forgive my Sanskrit pronunciation, but please go ahead and chant if you so desire.
You can try to.
Yes.
Yakshamano Shvamedhena Jnati Droha Jihasaya Raja Labdha Dhano Dadyo Nanitra Karadandayo.
Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you very much. Chandrasekhar Prabhu, Puna Mataji, would you like to try too?
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Yakshamano ashvamedhena gnati droha jihashaya rajalabda dhano dadyo nanyatra karadandayo. Hare Krishna.
Yakshamano swamedhena gnati droha jihasaya raja labdha dhano dadyo nanyatra karadandayo.
Thank you very much, Mataji. Okay, so we'll read the word. There's a short purport, but it's nice, and we can expand on it. Yakshamana, desiring to perform Ashvamedhena by the horse sacrifice ceremony. Nati Droha, fighting with kinsmen. Jihasaya, for getting free. Raja, King Yudhishthir. Labda Dham, for getting some wealth. Dadaya, part about it. Na anyatra, not otherwise. Kara dandayo, taxes and fines. Translation by His Divine Grace Prabhupada Ki Jai. Just at this time, King Yudhishthir was considering performing a horse sacrifice to get freed from sins incurred from fighting with kinsmen. But he became anxious to get some wealth, where there was no surplus funds outside of fines and tax collection. Just at this time, King Yudhishthir was considering performing a horse sacrifice to get freed from sins incurred from fighting with kinsmen. But he became anxious to get some wealth, for there were no surplus funds outside of fines and tax collections. Purport by His Divine Grace, as the Brahmanas and Vipras had a right to be subsidized by state, the state executive had the right to collect taxes and fines from the citizens. After the battle of Kurukshetra, the state treasury was exhausted, and therefore there was no surplus fund except the fund from tax collection and fines. Such funds were sufficient only for the state budget, and having no excess fund, the king was anxious to get more wealth in some other way in order to perform the horse sacrifice. Maharaj Yudhishthira wanted to perform this sacrifice under the instruction of Bhishma. Once again, the translation. Just at this time, King Yudhishthira was considering performing a horse sacrifice to get freed from the sins incurred from fighting with kinsmen. But he became anxious to get some wealth, for there were no surplus funds outside of fines and tax collection. Om Agyante Varadasya Dhananjana Shakara Chakshurunutam Yana Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. So, we're in chapter 12, the birth of Parikshit Maharaj. And this is a kind of the concluding section. We described how Yudhishthira Maharaj was trying to make sure that Parikshit Maharaj will be a true successor to their rulership of the kingdom. And he was informed that by the Brahmanas that indeed Parikshit Maharaj is a very blessed, pure devotee. And thus he underwent a birth ceremony, and the glories of Parikshit Maharaj were announced. And and at that point the Brahmanas left. And then it talked about how Parikshit Maharaj developed very nicely under the care of the Pandavas. And then during his youth, King Yudhishthira was trying to recover the kingdom. You know, in the United States, there's something like trillions of dollars of debt, and then there's been discussions about shutting down the government as a means of different parties kind of pushing forward their own view of how things should be resolved. And so Yudhishthira Maharaj went back to the basics and figured, okay, so he's thinking that there needs to be a Ashwamedha Yajna in order to get free from sins. But in order to do this yajna is a very opulent yajna, which engages many, many resources of a kingdom. Basically, the idea is that the horses or some sacrificial animal, horse usually, is free, and he goes to various kingdoms on Bharat, and he's accompanied by princes and warriors, and then those respective kingdoms, they have a right to either renounce the rulership or indicate their independence from the rulership of Yudhishthira Maharaj, or to accept that rulership and pay taxes, meaning because they're being protected by Yudhishthira Maharaj. And so it's a process of affirming that you actually have, people or states within your country that actually accept your governance. And it's a way of eventually collecting funds. So Yudhishthira Maharaj was trying to regain funds for the kingdom, because he's thinking, how is Parikshit Maharaj going to rule if the kingdom's going into tremendous debt? So, that's the practical aspect. And the subsequent verses will talk about how Lord Krishna advises the king, Yudhishthira, to send people to the Himalayan mountain range, because there was once in the past an emperor who had performed great sacrifices and gave lots of gold in charity to Brahmanas. And the Brahmanas got so much gold that they couldn't carry it, so they left it behind. And so Lord Krishna said to Yudhishthira that, hey, go send your people there and pick up the gold from there and you'll get the wealth. And then subsequently talks about how once he got the gold, Yudhishthira was able to do the Ashwamedha Yajna, and then had success. He was able to replenish the kingdom. And then at the end of this chapter, Bhagavan Shri Krishna goes back to Dwarka along with Arjuna and others of the Yadus. So that's the context here. So I wanted to explore specifically this concept of sacrifice. Animal sacrifice, of course, and then the purpose and the idea behind sacrifice. So that's what I was going to focus upon. Okay. Hare Krishna Bhagavatam Prabhu. Nice to see you joining. Welcome.
Thank you. Hare Krishna Prabhu.
And you can all hear me okay? I'm on the external speakers of the laptop. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Prabhu. You can hear Prabhu.
So I wanted to explore this concept of sacrifice and, including animal sacrifice, but sacrifice in general as well. So, because, horse sacrifice, horse is an animal, and also the idea behind sacrifice. So, in chapter 8 that we had read, very famous prayers of Queen Kunti, so important that Srila Prabhupada had it published as a separate book called the Prayers of Queen Kunti, where the purports are basically taken out of his Bhagavatam writings. So Queen Kunti was praying to Lord Krishna and concentrating her mind to the act of prayer and herself on Bhagavan Krishna. And Krishna accepted it. In the end, she says, all these prayers are beautiful and we spent lots of time reading over them. And here, to the Goswami, where Queen Kunti offers her response, says, the Lord, having heard the prayers of Kunti Devi, composed in choicest words for his glorification, mildly smiled. That smile was as enchanting as his mystic power. So, Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur says something very sweet, that smile by Lord Krishna was his reciprocation of prema. And that's how that smile, and it was as enchanting as mystic power, because prema for Bhagwan is Lord's Aladhi Shakti. So that smile is Lord Krishna's reciprocation. So the Lord then went into the palace of Hastinapur along with his men and wanted to leave for Dwarka. So Yudhishthira Maharaj essentially prevented him and begged that he stays a little longer. And this indicates that Krishna was controlled by the love of Yudhishthira Maharaj, by the prema within Yudhishthira Maharaj. Could not be forced to do that, but the prema within Yudhishthira Maharaj. was controlling Krishna. So Yudhishthira Maharaj then laments. He laments that the rest of the chapter talks about how he indicates that so much sinful activity has occurred. Now one could say, how is it that Yudhishthira Maharaj, who's a pure devotee, could fall into such a situation? And the idea here is that Bhagavan Krishna is reciprocating with him and making him unable to understand, the teachings that Yudhishthira Maharaj has heard for all of his lifetime from, his cousin Krishna. And the purpose is to Krishna is entering the heart of Yudhishthira Maharaj to essentially make him lose his judgment in a spiritual manner, just that he basically couldn't understand the teachings of Krishna. And as we see in the subsequent chapter, in the passing of Bhishma Dev, he can't even understand the instructions of Vyasadev and all these great personalities that come to visit along or Yudhishthira Maharaj and Bhishma Dev. And we see that the reason that Yudhishthira Maharaj was put into lamentation by Krishna Bhagavan was essentially to have Bhishma Dev enlighten Yudhishthira Maharaj, thereby showing that Bhishma Dev, he was trying to glorify Bhishma Dev through Yudhishthira Maharaj, and indicating that Bhishma Dev actually had great knowledge about dharma, etc. So there were like two competing premas going on. One was Yudhishthira Maharaj and Krishna, and one was Bhishma Dev and Krishna. And due to the strong prema of Yudhishthira Maharaj, Krishna was held back from leaving immediately for Dwarka. And therefore, Krishna created this temporary loss of judgment for Yudhishthira Maharaj. And this, lamentation or dejection, Yudhishthira Maharaj, comes out in this verse that we're reading, performing a horse sacrifice to get freed from the sins incurred from fighting with the kinsman. So we read in this chapter where Bhishma Dev instructs Yudhishthira Maharaj that by your intimate friendship, your Sakya Ras with Krishna, in a way, not exactly the same as of the Gopas, but by your intimate relationship with Krishna, you essentially forgot who he is. And he is the supreme controller. And as he's the supreme controller, time is under his energy. Time is the will of Krishna. And therefore, he had a desire, Krishna had this desire to have peace on earth. And that involved the process of a battle for which you were simply a nimitta matram, you were an instrument. And accept that as it is. So, then Bhishma Pitamaha proceeded, once Yudhishthira Maharaj accepted this And Krishna blessed Yudhishthira, Bhishma Pitama, that for 50 days he would be free of pain and be able to speak. And Bhishma Pitama instructed Yudhishthira, on this. And Yudhishthira started asking about the principles of, the dharma for rajas. And Bhishma Pitama explained in detail, giving the histories from the ancient past. Bhishma Pitama is a Vayu, so that's why he could not be killed by anyone, because he was invested with the potency of all the other Vayus. So Bhishma Pitama explained the acts of charity, yajna, practical duties, etc., that a king had to perform. And so this is why, here, Srila Prabhupada says, Maharaj Yudhishthira wanted to perform this sacrifice under the instructions of Bhishma Pitama. So that's kind of connecting what happened in chapter 8 and 9 to the situation subsequently after the passing of Bhishma Pitama, and then the birth ceremony of Parikshit Maharaj, and then Yudhishthira Maharaj contemplating how to create a suitable, healthy atmosphere for the kingdom. So that's the background here. Now, a couple of verses later, here, Srila Prabhupada says something very wonderful. So we can see Yudhishthira Maharaj's challenge in trying to understand how to govern and how to do activities in this world. And so I really liked what Srila Prabhupada says here. I'll read it. Maharaj Yudhishthira was the ideal and celebrated pious king of the world, and still he was greatly, notice he says ideal and celebrated pious king, yet he was greatly afraid after the execution of Battle of Kurukshetra because of mass killing, all of which was done only to install him. He therefore took all the responsibility for sins committed in warfare. So, see, what level of governance, what Vaishnava quality he has. And to get rid of these sins, he wanted to perform 3 sacrifices in which horses are offered at the altar. And then I won't spoil the event for others, the opportunity for subsequent devotees to read on this verse. But the point I wanted to focus on was this paragraph. One should take lessons from the acts of Maharaj Yudhishthira. He was afraid of sins committed on the battlefield. Therefore, he wanted to satisfy the supreme authority. This indicates that unintentional sins are also committed in our daily occupational discharge of duties. And to counteract even such unintentional crimes, one must perform sacrifices as they're recommended in the revealed scriptures. The Lord says in Bhagavad Gita, Yajna Artha Karmano Yatra Lokayam Karma Bandhana 3.9. That one must perform sacrifices recommended in scriptures in order to get rid of commitments of all unauthorized works, or even unintentional crimes which we are apt to commit. By doing so, one shall be freed from all kinds of sins. And those who do not do so, but work for self-interest or sense gratification, have to undergo all tribulations accrued from committed sins. Therefore, the main purpose of performing sacrifices is to satisfy the Supreme Personality Hari. The processes of sacrifice may be different in times, place, person, but the aim is one at all times. Satisfaction, Supreme Lord Shri Hari. Samsadir Haritosh. That is the way of pious life, and that is the way of peace and prosperity in the world at large. Maharaj Yudhishthira did all these as the ideal pious king in this world. So Srila Prabhupada is talking about that one in one's day-to-day activities, they're reactions to our activities. And Srila Prabhupada says in Bhagavad Gita, karma is that activity which results in us taking on another body. That's how he defines karma. That activity which results in us taking another body. So there has to be some activity that frees us from that consequent. And Srila Prabhupada is indicating that such activities, purificatory activities are called yajna or sacrifice. And their purpose is, of course, to satisfy Bhagwan, Shri Krishna. In chapter 8, it's interesting because he says, Yudhishthira Maharaj says, it is not possible to counteract the killing of men by sacrificing men. Srila Prabhupada says, so it's kind of interesting that later he's talking about this, about counteracting the sinful activities by performing 3 Ashwamedha yajnas, and then how to do the yajnas, he has to acquire wealth, etc. So Srila Prabhupada says, Ashwamedha yajnas or Govamedha yajnas, sacrifice in which a horse or a bull is sacrificed, were not, of course, for the purpose of killing the animals. Lord Chaitanya said that such sacrifices performed on the altar of yajna were rejuvenated. Such animals sacrificed on the altar of yajna were rejuvenated and a new life was given to them. It was just to prove the efficacy of the hymns of the Vedas. In this age of quarrel and hypocrisy, which is called Kali Yuga, there's no possibility of performing yajnas perfectly for want of expert brahmanas who can conduct such yajnas. Maharaj Yudhishthira therefore gives a hint to performing sacrifices. See, a hint, because he himself is saying here that you cannot counteract it by, Ashwamedha yajnas, the sinful reactions. In the age of Kali Yuga, the only sacrifice recommended is performance of Harinams and yajna, inaugurated by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So there's a very nice conversation that occurs. Let's see here. So this is a chapter from Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila. Can you guys still see my screen? Hare Krishna.
Yes, Prabhuji.
Okay. Thank you. So I pressed a button and then the screen changed. Pastimes of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in his youth, right, Prabhu? You can see that?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Okay. I remember reading this in your house through, this is a summary of Chaitanya Bhagavatam, of course. Reading this several years ago with you in your house. It was very nice. So in this, it's talking about the inauguration of the Sankirtan movement. So as we know, West Bengal at that time was ruled by the Qazi, the Muslim ruler. And Lord Chaitanya had engaged devotees in performing, and I'm just giving this as background in order to have that discussion about animal sacrifice. Lord Chaitanya had engaged devotees in chanting the holy name and dancing. And in response, the Qazi came into one of the homes. The Muslims were disturbed in Navadvip, and therefore they approached the Qazi, who was, I guess, kind of like the local minister. He wasn't as powerful as the Nawab, the governor, but he was the local minister in Navadvip. And the Qazi went into one of the homes of the local so-called Hindus, and said, not only will I take your wealth away, I will convert you into a Muslim if you continue doing this. So Lord Chaitanya was upset about this and said, no, I will kill all the Muslims if they obstruct this. And then they had a mass, Harinam Sankirtan, and went, and then eventually a conversation occurred between the Qazi and Lord Chaitanya. And the Qazi was, of course, you can imagine even if you're a very powerful governor, if hundreds and thousands of people come to your door in protest, something's got to give. So the Qazi came out and sat with the Lord Chaitanya and said, started talking that you've come in a very angry mood and I didn't come out, but kept myself hidden. Now that, after they met and kind of sat down to talk, he said, I've come to meet you. It's my good fortune. So Qazi's a diplomat. And he says, your maternal grandfather, Nilambar Chakravarti Thakur, was my uncle. Now, Srila Prabhupada comments on this verse and says, it was a tradition in the village that you may not have bodily relationship with somebody, but somebody who was older than you was your like chacha or dada. Chacha means your, uncle. And you were his, bhanja, etc. You were his nephew, essentially. And so Qazi speaks like this. He said, we had such a relationship, and, and if I, your uncle, your maternal uncle, because of my relationship with your maternal grandfather, do something offensive like, threaten the lives of people in conversion to Islam, that you shouldn't take it very seriously. And so they started talking about it's interesting how it went from that to Lord Chaitanya, of course, then starting asking questions. So Lord Chaitanya says, my dear uncle, to the Qazi, I've come to your home just to ask you some questions. Lord Chaitanya never just comes for asking just some questions. He's coming to give him bhakti. So the Lord said, you drink cow's milk, therefore the cow is your mother, and the bull produces grains for your maintenance, therefore he's your father. Since the bull and cow are your father and mother, how can you kill them? The Qazi replied, as you have on what strength are you so daring to commit such sinful activities? Qazi replies, you have your scriptures, called the Vedas and Puranas, and we have ours, known as Quran. According to the Quran, there are two ways of advancement, through increasing the propensity to enjoy and through decreasing the propensity to enjoy. On the path of decreasing attachment, nivritti marg, the killing of animals is prohibited. On the path of material activities, there's a regulation for killing cows. If such killing is done under the guidance of samsara, there's no sin. So Srila Prabhupada has a very nice statement. The word shastra is derived from the dhatu or verbal root shash. Shash dhatu pertains to controlling or ruling. A government's ruling through force of weapons is called shastra. Thus, whenever there's ruling, so notice the difference between this and this. There's a long there's short shastra. Thus, whenever there's ruling, either by weapons or injunctions, the shastra is a basic principle. Between shastra, ruling through weapons, and shastra, ruling through injunctions, the scriptures, better is shastra. Our Vedic scriptures are not ordinary law books of human common sense. They're statements of factually liberated persons, unaffected by the imperfectness of senses. So I thought that was a very nice explanation of how to understand this, what the Qazi is saying. So there's maybe rules for governance, but above them as rules of our scriptures. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu goes on to say in verse 58, as a learned scholar, the Kazi challenged Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. In your Vedic scriptures, there's an injunction for killing a cow. On the strength of this injunction, great sages perform sacrifice involving cow killing. Refuting the Kazi's statement, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu immediately replied, the Vedas clearly enjoin that cows should not be killed. Therefore, every Hindu, whoever he may be, avoids indulging in cow killing. And Srila Prabhupada proves this by saying this verse, Shri Goraksha Abhunam Vaishya Karma Swabhavaja. Swabhava means one's nature. The duty of Vaishyas is to produce agriculture products and give protection to the cows. So Lord Chaitanya checkmated him, on his argument. So in the Vedas Puranas, there are injunctions declaring that if one can revive a living being, one can kill it for experimental purposes. So from that word, interesting. Therefore, the great sages sometimes killed old cows, and by chanting Vedic hymns, they brought them back to life for perfection. The killing and rejuvenation of such old and invalid cows was not truly killing, but an act of benefit, great benefit. Formerly, there were powerful Brahmanas who could make such experiments using Vedic hymns, but now, because of Kali Yuga, Brahmins are not so powerful. Therefore, the killing of cows and bulls for rejuvenation is forbidden. In this age of Kali, 5 acts are forbidden: the offering of horse in sacrifice, the offering of cow in sacrifice. So Ashwamedha Yajna cannot be done. Acceptance of orders of sannyas, the offering of oblations of flesh to the forefathers, and a man's begetting children in his brother's wife. Since you Muslims cannot bring killed cows back to life, you're responsible for killing them, right? This is like him saying that the cows were rejuvenated in the previous Vedic acts of yajna in prior ages, but you don't have that potency to do that. You cannot benefit that animal. So you should not be doing this. You will have consequences. And then he explains there are many mistakes and illusions in your scriptures. Their compilers, not knowing the essence of knowledge, gave orders that were against reason and argument. And so after this, the Kazi kind of accepted this statement. So the idea here is it's explaining that sacrifice is not just a process of causing harm. Sacrifice also has sacrifice is there for the purpose of pleasing Lord Krishna and also benefiting the animal that's sacrificing. So there's kind of like more description of this in the pastime of the encounter between Lord Shiva and Daksha, and the kind of like the innocent bystander, which is Sati, Lord Shiva's wife. So Sati knows that Daksha has enmity towards Lord Shiva and disrespects him. And if any of you want to read about the glories of Lord Shiva, read this chapter. It's really nice. She glorifies him very genuinely and lovingly. After all, she's his wife, so she knows his nature. So she comes back because she has, even though she knows her father has tremendous disrespect for Lord Shivji, she comes back because of familial attraction. And Lord Shiva warned her that, if you go back to your parental home, you're going to suffer as a result, because your father does not have goodwill towards me, and you won't be able to accept that, and that'll cause you pain in your heart. So she does eventually, she understands where he's coming from, but she's still a daughter. So she went back, and there was a sacrifice occurring in Daksha's home. And Srila Prabhupada says something very wonderful. They said it was an animal sacrifice. The great sages were all brahmanas, demigods were all there. There were many sacrificial animals, etc. So Srila Prabhupada makes a point. Another significant point in this verse is that there were animals for sacrifice. That these animals were meant for sacrifice does not mean they were meant to be killed. The great sages and realized souls assembled there performing yagas, and their realization was tested. Their realization was tested. The Brahman realization. Interesting, huh, Bhavanata Prabhu? You took deity worship. Can you imagine the strength of one's chanting in order to be able to, determine their purity in performing such a yajna, where an animal sacrifice and it's rejuvenated? That's what Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was talking about when he said this experiment. The Brahmanas are entrusted with performance of yajna and were very realized souls, and to test their realization, an old animal was offered fire and rejuvenated. This was the test of a Vedic mantra, of course, also a benefit for everybody else there. The animals were gathered, not meant to be killed and eaten. So it's not that you kill a horse and then you eat it, or you kill a cow and do a sacrifice and you eat it, etc. The real purpose of a sacrifice was not, he's talking about animal sacrifice specifically, not to replace a slaughterhouse, but to test a Vedic mantra by giving animal new life. So, so the idea is that it's not, for like meat eating, that this is being performed. And Bhagavad Gita, again and again, Lord Krishna emphasizes that sacrifices must be performed, right? He says this in chapter 3 and chapter 4, O chastiser of the enemy. The sacrifice, he's talking about different types of sacrifice, but he says sacrifice performed in knowledge is better than the mere sacrifice of material possessions. After all, O son of Parth, all sacrifices culminate in transcendental knowledge. All sacrifices culminate in transcendental knowledge. So the idea here is that to gain relief from material distress, one has to ultimately come into service of Bhagwan. And one of those processes is yajna. And sacrifice occurs in all different types of faith, where people offer something in return for some benefit that they're receiving, material or spiritual. But it's a mysterious process. And so Lord Krishna says in here, sorry, go back here, this famous verse. The most very often quoted, Yagnartha karma nitya lokayam karma bandhana tad artham karma kontaya mukta sangha samcharachara. That one must perform acts of sacrifices recommended in the scriptures, is what Krishna is saying, in order to get rid of unintentional activities, like Srila Prabhupada wrote down in 12.34, that if one should take lessons from the act of Maharaj Krishna, that unintentional sins also committed in daily discharge of duties. Right? So, and by doing this yajna for the satisfaction of the Lord, one can be freed from all kinds of reactions. But if we just do activities out of self-interest, then we undergo challenges in life. So So what to take away from this? That Lord created this process of yajna as a means of reciprocation, so that we can free ourselves from the egoism of thinking we're the doers and the enjoyers, and absorb our mind in the act of the intention of a yajna. Most people think of yajna as a havan kund, like a fire. But more important is to think about the intent behind the activity. Intent behind the activity is the most crucial purpose of a yajna. And that intent of that activity should be to satisfy Bhagavan, Samsadir Haritoshan, as it says in Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 2, verse 13. So we must understand that. So I wanted to end with this. So this is, so I talked about yajna, specifically animal sacrifice, as explained by Srila Prabhupada in this particular chapter, in verse 34, as well as in the detailed conversation between the Chand Kazi and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and specifically the purport given by Srila Prabhupada on the sacrifices that were occurring in the home of Daksha, which Sati witnessed. And then how this act of karma bandhana, bondage, can be overcome by the act of yajna, offering back to the source of everything and for the satisfaction of that source, and thereby relieving ourselves instantaneously of the karmic reaction of an activity. This is a science that can be learned. And Krishna consciousnus is the means of understanding that science. So in chapter 12, Canto 12, chapter 3, Shukadeva Goswami explains, it's kind of wrapping up his instruction to, we just had Bhadra Purnima and welcoming of Bhagavatam in quite a few homes, which is wonderful. Shukadeva Goswami says, Almighty Parikshit, I related to you the narrations of all these great kings, because throughout Bhagavatam you'll see not just narrations of the avatars, but also the Raja Rishis who spread their fame throughout the world and then departed. My real purpose was to teach transcendental knowledge and renunciation. And you can see that in the example of Yudhishthira Maharaj. Stories of kings lend power and opulence to these narrations, but do not in themselves constitute the ultimate aspect of knowledge. The purpose who desires pure devotional service to Lord Krishna should hear the narrations of Lord's Uttama Shloka's glorious qualities, the constant chanting of which destroys everything inauspicious. So we talked about on Friday at the home welcoming ceremony or gathering that we had about Narad Muni diagnosing the dissatisfaction Shri Vyasadeva, and that dissatisfaction, he said, was because of two things. One, that in your profuse writings of the Vedas and the Puranas and the Mahabharats and the Vedanta Sutra, you have done great service to all of humanity, without a doubt. But you have spoken mostly about Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. And you have ignored that which should be glorified. So diagnosis 1. And diagnosis 2 is that you needed to glorify the Lord repeatedly. So Narad Muni, being a very expert physician and spiritual master, knew that the cure for this disease was the glorification of the Lord's qualities. And that's when Vyasadeva after that instruction by Nad Muni, and the subsequent chapter 7 talks about Vyasadev's Samadhi vision. After that, he revised Srimad Bhagavatam into what Shukadeva Goswami heard from him. So that's what Shukadeva Goswami is talking about, that it's great to talk about kings and all that, but ultimately the purpose of Bhagavatam is to glorify Lord's activities and qualities. And so Maharaj Parikshit asks a very genuine question. How can persons living in Kali Yuga rid themselves of the cumulative contamination of this age? Oh, great sage, please explain this to me. So that's what Srila Prabhupada is referencing when he talks in, this 34, that the unintentional sins are also committed in our daily occupational discharge of duties. So Shukadeva Goswami says later, by engaging in the same chapter 3, Canto 12, engaging in process of demigod worship, austerities, breath control, compassion, bathing in holy places, strict vows, charity, chanting various mantras, one's mind cannot attain the same absolute purification that achieved when the unlimited personality of Godhead appears within one's heart. Therefore, O King, endeavor with all your might to fix Supreme Lord Keshav within your heart. Maintain this concentration upon the Lord, and at the time of that, you will attain the supreme destination. My dear King, Lord is the ultimate controller. He's supreme soul and supreme shelter. When meditated upon those about to die, he reveals to them his own eternal spiritual nature. So the idea that he's saying, Shukadeva Goswami to Parikshit Maharaj, is if we can manmanav, if we can absorb our mind on Krishna, then what does he do? Of course, he does sarva dharma patiyaje mamekam sharanam vraj, right? But what Bhagavatam is saying is that what will happen as a result of this is that he will extend his prema towards us. But why? Because from him arise all sadhanas, including sadhana bhakti. And as you all know, sadhana bhakti is also bhava bhakti in an immature stage. We know that from nectar devotion. So the idea is, from him also arise the results of the sadhanas. And so, because he's the shelter of all sadhakas, the ultimate purpose is bhava bhakti, or at a more advanced stage, prema bhakti. That's what arises. That's what Shukadeva Goswami is saying here. So then one can say, okay, how does this absorption of the mind connect and having prema arise in one's heart? How does that demonstrate the Lord's glories? And he speaks that in these two very famous verses. Kalir dosha nidhi rajan astahi eko mahaguna kirtanad eva krishnasya mukta sangha parambhajit. My dear King, although Kali Yuga is an ocean of fault, there is still one good quality of this age. Simply by chanting the Hare Krishna mantra, one can be free from material bondage and be promoted to the transcendental kingdom. So that's one aspect of his magnanimity. And then the second attribute is Kirtadad yad dhyayato vishnum trityat yajyata makahi dwarpa pracharyana kalo tad dhari kirtana. Whatever result was obtained in Satya Yuga by meditating on Vishnu, Treta Yuga by performing sacrifice, and Dwarpa Yuga by serving the Lord's lotus feet can be obtained in Kali Yuga simply by chanting the Maha Mantra. So the second thing. So his ultimate magnanimity is as qualities decrease in the successive yogas of the living beings, as qualities decrease, the potency of the medicine for that particular yuga to absorb oneself in Krishna increases. So Lord is not stone. He sees that our capability is decreasing. So the medicine goes from an oral antibiotic, to use the example that Shilpa used to use, to like an IV, intravenous antibiotic. So it can have a much stronger impact on us because of the force of the yuga that we're in. So thank you for listening. I know I went over time. Sorry. I had some challenges with Zoom where it made me log in again. So I started about 6 minutes late. But I hope that we are able to cover the topics that Srila Prabhupada introduced here. Just at this time, this was our verse, just at this time, King Yudhishthira was considering performing horse sacrifice to get freed from sins incurred from fighting with kinsmen. But he became anxious to get some wealth, for there were no surplus funds outside of fines and tax collections. Jai Srila Prabhupada, Vanchakalpa Trubhyasya Kripasindavyeva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavyo Namo Namaha. Thank you all for joining. Any corrections, comments, reflections, other ways that you've thought about this verse and its intended or implied meaning?
Thanks, Prabhuji. It was a very nice class. I really liked the can you hear me still?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I really liked the Chantazi and that incident that you narrated or you showed. That was very nice. And thank you for such a nice class, Prabhuji.
Thank you for appreciation.
Hare
Thank
Krishna.
you, Krishna. Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
I like this point that you made of the intention behind the yajna. It's not just the yajna kund and the swahas and everything, but what is the intention behind it? Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I thought, it takes something that I was reading is, our material consciousness is so strong that it goes into spiritual activities like chanting the holy name, worshiping the deities, where we think the deities are like objects for us to gain favor or attract more attention from the public, etc., rather than know the deities are there to accept our service. That this material consciousness is so strong that it goes even into spiritual activities. And as a result, we start thinking of yajna as, I'll do this for you, you do this for me. Like I remember reading somewhere that at a Sri Vaishnava temple in somewhere in California, I don't remember the exact situation, someone went up to the pujari and said, can you ask the Lord that can he give me, this thing in my business? And the pujari said, he's the Lord of the universe. How can I ask Bhagavan something like that for you? It's like, that's not the purpose of, your offering to Lord. It's to satisfy him. So I think that material consciousness is so strong, it goes into, unfortunately, even into spiritual life or sadhanas. Thank you. I thought you would like the section about, where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Srila Prabhupada talk about how, in that Daksha pastime of how the potency was, the sacrifice was in one way to, of course, give new life to this animal, would be elevated. Srila Prabhupada elsewhere says that animal was elevated to human life with their sacrifice in a Vedic yajna. But also I thought that was interesting where it's like test the power of that Brahman, of his chanting to revive that living being, that animal. So I thought that was very interesting. So, okay, any other comments or questions? Clarification?
Prabhu, thank you so much, Prabhu, for a wonderful exposition, detail about sacrifice. Thank you so much, Prabhu. It was very, very instructive, very beautiful class, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you for your appreciation. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and end. Thank you all. All glories to His Divine Grace. Srila Prabhupada. Please join us for Sunday feast. Haribol. Bye-bye.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhupada. Hope you're well.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Thank you very much for this.
Hare Krishna.
Okay.
Bye-bye.